Alright, so hey everyone, today I want to take a look at the dead zones for Destiny 2. I've covered this before, but they've added some dead zone options, so we're taking another look at it. So by default, for movement, we have about a 25% rounded square dead zone. This is created by having first creating an axial dead zone, and then applying a radial dead zone on top. The axial dead zone adds to the general size, but it's mainly responsible for restricting diagonal movement around the axes. So if your stick is anywhere in these blue regions, you'll be moving in one of 4 cardinal directions. So here, they'll be moving perfectly forward, perfectly back, perfectly left, and perfectly right. And to attempt to demonstrate this, I'll use the border of this entryway, and you can see that when moving backwards within this region, I'm perfectly aligned with it, but once you move into the green region, you start deviating from it. The shaded region represents the sprint threshold, so if you attempt to sprint under this, nothing will happen. And if you're in the region, you'll begin sprinting. And to stop sprinting, you need to either fall under it or move at an angle wide enough to fall out of it. You might notice that this is pretty round, but it does flatten out within the axial region. You'll see how that changes in the differing dead zone sizes. But for the camera, we have an about 23% rounded square dead zone, so exactly the same, just a hair smaller. And the same level of restricted diagonal movement, so the same axial dead zone, and you don't see diagonal movement occur until you break into these green regions. And this is most obvious when capping the view up or down and looking for horizontal movement. The shaded regions might be difficult to see over here, but within these axial regions, that's really the only thing that's demonstrated on the graph. There's an acceleration jump, and this threshold continues off the graph in a circular shape. And for horizontal acceleration, you can see that it sort of begins triggering here and falls here. The horizontal and vertical acceleration are completely separate, so and overlap very slightly in the perfect diagonals. You won't be able to see the full threshold. I'll put the dot graph there, but there's a slim region where both the horizontal and vertical acceleration trigger at the same time. But for the most part, you'll only trigger the horizontal and vertical acceleration separately. The mini cursor has the exact same dead zone as the camera, so it's slightly smaller than this movement dead zone on the overlay, but it's not too big enough to really make a difference to switch it. But you can see the restriction when clamping it to the edge of the screen like this, and looking the same way there. But we got both separate axial and radial dead zones. So by default, axial is 12 and radial is 13. And if we take a look at the maximum and switch the graph, we can first see that these dead zone options affect all the dead zones at the same time. So you can see now that the cursor dead zone is about 50%. And since it's basically the same as other ones, I'll jump back in here. So the movement dead zone is about 52%-ish. And the reason why the dead zone isn't 60% is because the axial dead zone adds 30% of the dead zone size, but the radial dead zone is relative to the remaining range. So the radial dead zone is contributing 30% of the remaining 70%. So it's not quite adding up to an expected 60%. So in general, for smaller axial dead zones values, they add up more straightforwardly, but the larger the axial dead zone, the less nicely they add up. But you can see here that the axial dead zone being larger means that much more of the stick is limited to just 4 directions. So you can see that now I need to move even further before diagonal movement begins. And the sprint threshold has been, it's about the same distance proportionally, but you can see that it's quite a bit flatter than it was because the axial dead zone is stretching out the radial portion of this, but otherwise it functions the same. So if your stick is in the shaded region, you're allowed to sprint, and if it's not, then you don't. So the camera is exactly the same, only slightly smaller, and this is accurate to the dead zone values. The movement dead zone is actually slightly larger than what the dead zone options would depict, and we'll see that in just a second. But we have the same restriction, so I can make these large bobbing motions and the camera is moving perfectly left. And you don't see diagonal movement until you break into these green regions. And looking up is still the easiest way to see this movement start occurring. And the acceleration jump range is even harder to tell. It's very slight on this drawn graph, but to show the dot graph, you can see that the acceleration threshold has been pushed out significantly. And this is pretty dangerous because, as you can see here, my stick can only irregularly move outside of this radial region, so I'm unable to consistently hit this acceleration range. So that's a big issue with axial dead zones, is they can push these kinds of thresholds out far enough so that your stick can't reach them. But to now look at the minimum dead zones, you can see that the mini cursor now moves with any stick movement and has full diagonal movement. So moving right around an axis, it'll change direction. But for movement, you actually have about a 2% dead zone or so. This is very slight, so it's not too noticeable. But if you look down at the feet, you can see that you're moving, and you can actually stop if I can center it well enough. So there's a very slight movement dead zone for whatever reason, but otherwise the axial dead zone is completely gone. So you have subtle diagonals, and since the sliders control both dead zones, it's a little too hard to show movement, diagonal movement with movement. But you can see the sprint threshold is now perfectly circular because the axial dead zone isn't warping it. So otherwise it functions exactly the same. When you're in the shade region, you're allowed to start sprinting, and when you fall under it, you stop. For the camera, the dead zone options are accurate, so you have a true 0% dead zone, so any right stick movement creates camera movement. And you have full diagonal movement, so if I make these bobbing motions right around the vertical axis, you'll see that being applied. But if I look up or down, this is much more obvious, where you see the direction flip right over this axis. You can see here that the acceleration threshold is now perfectly within this drawn radial region. So using just radial dead zones is typically most ideal because the thresholds are always accessible. So you don't have to hope that your stick can lean further in the corners to trigger that. But I've demonstrated changing these at the same time. Of course, you can change these independently. So to demonstrate what that looks like, we have perfectly, at least with movement, it's not quite perfectly square, and that's because there's a slight radial dead zone that's slightly increasing the dead zone size, but also changing the shape to a very slight rounded square dead zone. And the camera is perfectly square, so this is exactly a 12% square dead zone. So the axial dead zone doesn't just restrict diagonal movement, it also adds to the general dead zone size. But when you're using these independently, this is accurate. So when I switch to the radial dead zone, this is, at least for the camera, perfectly 13%. So since there's no axial dead zone, the full size of the radial dead zone is being expressed. It's only when they're together that the radial contribution gets a little smaller. And you can see that the diagonals are still fully expressed, and a radial dead zone size doesn't change the diagonal thresholds for the acceleration jump. But to go back to the 0% dead zone, for the acceleration curve, we have a sort of exponential curve. It's not a power function, but it starts out slow and then builds up to till this jump at about 98%. And this jump on the curve is about 1.6 or 6 to 1.7 times increase, and then flat lines after that. What's interesting about the acceleration curve is the curve itself doesn't change, but the sensitivity is hard capped at 720 degrees per second, and any speed potentially beyond that is simply capped to that. So if you use a lower sensitivity, let's take it all the way down to 1, the curve, the actual shape of the curve is the same, but this jump is much more dramatic. It's actually a 3 times jump. And so normally, I didn't test all the permutations, but this curve and jump stay consistent up until it hits 720 degrees per second, and then it just caps. And the this general sensitivity increases throughout the entire sensitivity range, but the acceleration after you hit 720 degrees, and that's around sensitivity 9 or 10. The jump doesn't get any larger and functionally gets proportionally smaller relative to your general sensitivity. So that's interesting, and before the sensitivity increased from 10 to 20, the previous cap was 360. So we had the same kind of general trend, just boosted to 720 now. This was present in Halo Infinite, or first noticed in Halo Infinite, and that user had noticed it between the sensitivities there, and it's exactly the same here, and that trend probably started in Halo Reach, which both games share the same sort of fundamental controls, so that's probably present there, even though I haven't tested it to look at it. But as I said, the maximum is 720 degrees, but this is with the acceleration jump. And all the way down to 1. At 1, your maximum turn speed is 240 degrees per second. If the acceleration jump wasn't capped and you still had that basically 3 times acceleration jump at 20 sensitivity, you'd actually get a speed of about 1380 degrees per second. So that's definitely comfortably in Call of Duty maximum territory. So that'd be extremely fast. But if you remove this acceleration jump, you'd actually have a maximum turn speed of about 460 degrees per second. That's still pretty brisk. You can see I'm pulling it off here. So this is still a pretty brisk sensitivity. And as a comparison, Apex Legends and Titanfall 2 seem to have a pretty even 500 degree per second maximum. So that's pretty in line with that. As far as the vertical sensitivity appears to be about 60% of the horizontal, and many players like lower vertical sensitivity, but there is no option for it. And the issue with having a lower vertical sensitivity is that one, if you want it the same speed, you just can't have that. But it also changes your diagonal movement. So when you point the stick in a direction like this, I'm expecting to move the stick at 45 degrees. But it might be a little too subtle to tell, but it's actually not moving at 45 degrees. This is because the vertical sensitivity is being reduced, and so your output diagonals are more horizontally biased than they should be. So all your angles are essentially inaccurate and biased horizontally. And before these dead zone options where you could get rid of the axial dead zones, you'd have that plus the axial dead zones restricting diagonal movement and making them inaccurate because of that. So, but here with 0 axial dead zone, you just have the reduced vertical sensitivity affecting your diagonal movement. Something that also affects your diagonal movement is these separate axial acceleration jumps. So if I reduce this fully to try to demonstrate this, and actually I'll reduce the ADS to try to demonstrate it as well. So you have your normal sensitivity being angles being skewed because of the lower vertical sensitivity, but when you move into these regions, so here this horizontal movement is applying, and it's only applying to the horizontal axis. So this, similar to suppressing the vertical sensitivity, is accelerating the horizontal sensitivity, and this makes it so that your while the horizontal acceleration is active, your direction is actually even more horizontally biased. And I'm going to use the ADS to attempt to demonstrate this. Let's see if I can stop moving. But you can see that I'm moving at this angle, just short of 45 degrees. but when I move into the horizontal acceleration, you might tell that it's sped up horizontally, but sort of flattened out in its direction. And to try to look at this vertically, going at this angle, going to the vertical acceleration, and it looks like it's going more vertically. So without acceleration, with acceleration. And it might be difficult to tell, but that's how it's functioning. So I can try to cover it a bit more even. So a bit horizontal, without acceleration, and with acceleration. It's pretty flat. The only time that both axis accelerations are triggering at the same time is in these slight slivers where both are triggering at the same time. And in these regions, you actually have this acceleration jump doesn't affect your diagonal movement because it's being applied to both axes evenly. So that's one of the changes that should happen, is that this threshold should be made unified. So once you move past this distance, both the vertical and horizontal acceleration get applied evenly. As far as let's keep this at 10, the ADS sensitivity modifier, by default it's 1, but this isn't a multiplier. It's not like, while it's at 1, you're moving the same as your hipfire. At a value of 1, this your ADS sensitivity is about 72% of your hipfire. So a little slower, but at 0.5, it's about 36% of your hipfire. And at 1.5, this is about 107% of your hipfire. So it's actually faster, and this value doesn't change the curve, so the curve is identical to what your hip fire sensitivity is, and this actually goes faster. So as I said, it's 107% of your hip fire speed. If you have this at 10 or faster sensitivity, where the cap is 720 degrees, turning into ADS actually goes faster slightly than that. So the cap is being applied before the ADS multiplier is applied. So you can actually break a bit further than that by using faster ADS if you ever felt that was useful. So the last thing to talk about is aim assist. Aim assist in this game, of course, applies. The aim assists here aren't as strong as they were in the Halo series, but they're still pretty obvious. Hopefully I'll try to get a decent clip to show on screen. But there are 3 types. One is tracking. So when you stray past a target, your cursor will get stuck to them and track them for some distance. There's slowdown, which where your camera or your crosshair passes over a target within a certain range, your sensitivity will drop significantly. And together, those are normally termed sticky aim. But then there is bullet magnetism, which when your cursor turns red, or if your crosshair is close enough to a target, the bullets will redirect to hit them. I'm not as familiar with Destiny's mechanics. I think that the bullet magnetism specifically has a specific weapon stat. Someone can correct me on that, and that'll be changed there. But that about covers things. To speak about some of the improvements that can be made, the Deadzone options are a great addition. They make the camera movement feel quite a bit better than it has been for a while. But there are definitely improvements that can be made. The first obvious one is that these options, there should be separate dead zone options for the movement and camera dead zones. Some players might like very low camera dead zones, but small movement dead zones might not be preferable, because as you can see, it's hard for me to stop moving completely, and it might would be useful to have separate ones so that players who want to use a moderate or large movement dead zone can still do that while playing at a small camera dead zone. Additionally, it'd be nice to control the acceleration curve. There's nothing wrong with this curve itself, but players have different preferences on what curves they might like to use, and I'm not sure what function Destiny is using for its curve, but you can have relatively similar functions with this kind of functionality, where you have a curve similar to Destiny's that can scale to linear and anywhere in between in different ways. So being able to customize it like that would give players a ton of control over their aim, because depending on the player, this curve might be too sluggish. They might want a linear curve, and some may even want it more precise. The acceleration jump should be given an option. So by default, it's about 3 times, unless it's unless the jump is getting suppressed by the a sensitivity cap. Players sometimes don't enjoy this. So having a slider that allows players to customize the intensity of this would be requested, something that could completely disable this. So basically a 1 times multiplier where there's none, up to a 3 times multiplier, which is the current default. The acceleration jump threshold should be made into a unified threshold. So if your stick is anywhere past 98%, both the horizontal and vertical axes should be accelerated, and this would correct the diagonal movement inconsistencies that causes. And similar to that, a slider controlling the acceleration, the vertical sensitivity should be added to address the lower vertical sensitivity, or even if players want to, they could use that to reduce the vertical sensitivity further. A slider would allow both players to be catered to. Lastly, the aim assist should be given an option. Bullet magnetism is heavily tied, or weapon balance is heavily tied to bullet magnetism, so that would not make a whole lot of sense to be able to remove. But at least the sticky aim, both the slowdown and tracking, should be allowed to either be toggled off completely or given sliders to customize them individually. That could be useful for players who only want to have the tracking and not the slowdown, or vice versa. Some players have issues where they're trying to shoot at a target and another target runs in front of them, and the tracking can be frustrating like that, or the slowdown can be frustrating when the sensitivity you're moving around with is completely different from the one when you're aiming over a target with, and that can feel inconsistent. And based on players' preference, they can fine-tune it to their preference. I think that could also apply to the menus as well. The menus do have aim assist, so when passing over an icon, your sensitivity slows down. And this is, the pettiest of issues, but this does make cursor or menu navigation quite a bit slower, just because any icon you can interact with just dramatically slows down the sensitivity. So it took a while to get dead zone options, so I don't know if this is likely to get those improvements in Destiny 2, but at least for any future Bungie titles, hopefully those are considered to further improve the controls. So that about covers things, though. So thanks for watching, and everyone, have a good rest of your day.